Today we're going to talk about one of the most potent, most explosive, and ultimately one of the most heartbreaking voices in music history. A man who embodied the raw, untamed spirit of the 1960s soul. They called him the Wicked Pickett, and for a time he was untouchable, a titan who could make the world dance with a single growl. But the same fire that fueled his music would eventually consume the man, leaving behind a legacy of unforgettable sound and a cautionary tale of a soul left abandoned long after the spotlight had faded. This is the story of Wilson Pickett. To truly understand the lightning strike that was Wilson Pickett, we have to transport ourselves back in time. Not just to the 1960s, but to the world that forged him, Prattville, Alabama, in the 1940s. This was the Deep South, a landscape defined by the rigid, brutal realities of Jim Crow segregation. But it was also a place of profound, earth-shaking faith. For a young Wilson Pickett, born in 1941 as the fourth of 11 children, life was a study in contrasts. The daily humiliations of a segregated society existed alongside the ecstatic release of the Baptist Church. His home life was far from idyllic. Pickett would later describe his mother in stark, unforgiving terms, calling her the baddest woman in my book. He spoke of harsh whippings with whatever was at hand, a formative experience of violence that undoubtedly left deep psychological scars. He learned early that survival sometimes meant fighting back, a lesson that would echo throughout his life. His refuge, his escape, was music. But not just any music. The gospel music of the South wasn't a gentle, passive affair. It was fervent. It was loud. It was a full-body experience where preachers would wreck the house, shouting and screaming with the Holy Spirit. This wasn't just performance. It was catharsis. It was in this crucible of sacred fire and domestic pain that Wilson Pickett's voice was born. A scream of defiance, a cry for salvation, a roar of pure, unvarnished feeling. Like so many African Americans of his generation, Pickett saw his future not in the cotton fields of Alabama, but in the industrial promise of the North. In 1955, at just 14 years old, he joined the Great Migration, moving to Detroit to live with his father. Detroit was a world away from Prattville. It was a city of steel and sound where the hum of the automotive factories was matched by the burgeoning rhythm of a new kind of music. It was here that he started to bridge the gap between the sacred and the secular. He joined a local gospel harmony group, the Violin Heirs, touring churches across the country. He was honing his craft, learning how to command an audience with the sheer force of his vocal presence. But the strictures of gospel were too tight for a spirit as restless as Pickett's. The raw, bluesy themes of love, loss, and earthly desire were calling to him. In 1959, he made the leap. He was invited to join the Falcons, a group that would become one of the most important incubators of soul talent. The Falcons weren't just another doo-wop group, they were pioneers. Their sound becoming grittier, more impassioned, and pointing the way towards what would become soul music. Alongside future stars like Eddie Floyd and Mac Rice, Pickett found his place. And in 1962, he stepped up to the lead microphone and delivered a performance that put the music world on notice. The song was I Found a Love. It wasn't a polished pop song. It was raw, desperate, and utterly electrifying. Pickett's voice, pleading, screaming, and ad-libbing, transformed it into a primal masterpiece. You can hear the gospel preacher in his delivery, but the subject matter was purely of the flesh. The song became a major R&B hit, and it was clear that Wilson Pickett was not destined to be a background singer. His talent and his ego were simply too big to share the stage. By 1964, armed with a demo of a song he'd written called If You Need Me, he was ready to go solo. His solo journey began with a small taste of the music industry's harsh realities. He sent his demo to Jerry Wexler, the legendary producer and executive at Atlantic Records. Wexler loved the song, but in a move that stung Pickett, he gave it to Solomon Burke, another of Atlantic's powerhouse soul singers. Burke's version became a massive hit. Pickett was incensed, but Wexler, recognizing the raw diamond he had on his hands, signed Pickett to a contract anyway. He knew that this fiery, resentful young man had something special. The challenge was figuring out how to capture it. Wexler's first genius move was to not record Pickett in New York. He sensed that the slick, polished environment of Atlantic's main studios wouldn't suit Pickett's raw Southern grit. Instead, he sent him down to Memphis, Tennessee, to a converted movie theater on East McLemore Avenue that had become a musical holy ground, Stax Records. Imagine Pickett, the Alabama-born, Detroit-hardened singer, walking into Stax for the first time. This was a world unto itself. In the heart of the segregated South, Stax was an oasis of integration. The house band, Booker T and the MGs, two white musicians, guitarist Steve Cropper and bassist Donald Duck Dunn, and two black musicians, organist Booker T. Jones and drummer Al Jackson Jr., was the tightest, funkiest rhythm section on the planet. There was no pretense here. It was all about the groove, the feeling. But the initial sessions were difficult. Pickett's explosive energy didn't immediately mesh with the MGS' famously laid-back in-the-pocket groove. There was tension. Pickett was demanding, used to being the undisputed center of attention. The Stax crew were masters of understatement. As Steve Cropper later recalled, they were struggling to find a rhythm that worked. The breakthrough came from a moment of pure, spontaneous inspiration. During a break, Wexler, Pickett, and Cropper were talking about a popular dance at the time called the jerk. But Wexler had another idea. He said, what about the midnight hour? The idea that love is better in the midnight hour. The phrase sparked something. They started building a song around it. But the magic ingredient was still missing. It was the drummer, Al Jackson Jr., who suggested they use the delayed backbeat rhythm he'd picked up from his father's jazz band. A distinctive 1-2, 1-2, 3-4, where the snare hit on the 2 and 4 is just a fraction of a second late. It created a feeling of irresistible tension and release. Then they added one more layer. Steve Cropper remembered watching a group of teenagers dancing outside the studio, doing a move where they lifted a foot on one beat and brought it down on the next. He translated that visual rhythm to his guitar, creating the song's iconic stabbing chords. Everything clicked into place. Over this simmering hypnotic groove, Pickett unleashed his voice. In the Midnight Hour wasn't just a hit. It was a revolution in a 3-minute package. It became an anthem, a sound that defined the summer of 1965 and set the template for a new, harder-edged style of soul. The success was immense, but the relationship with Stax was short-lived. A business dispute between Jerry Wexler and Stax president Jim Stewart meant that Atlantic artists were no longer welcome to record there. Wexler now had a problem. Where could he send his wicked Pickett to find that same Southern magic? The answer lay a few hundred miles southeast, in a tiny, unassuming town in Alabama called Muscle Shoals. If Stax was an oasis, FAME Studios in Muscle Shoals was a wellspring. Run by the brilliant and notoriously tough producer Rick Hall, FAME was another place where a group of local white musicians, later nicknamed the Swampers, were creating some of the funkiest, most soulful music in America. When Pickett arrived, the atmosphere was electric and, at times, explosive. Rick Hall was every bit as strong-willed as Pickett. Their sessions were legendary for their intensity. Stories abound of screaming matches and creative clashes. One famous, though perhaps apocryphal tale, claims Pickett once pulled a gun during a dispute. Whether true or not, it speaks to the volatile chemistry in that studio. It was a pressure cooker, but out of that pressure came diamonds. They recorded a string of Pickett's biggest and most enduring hits at FAME. The frantic energy of Land of 1,000 Dances, the swaggering funk of funky Broadway, and the song that would become his signature anthem, Mustang Sally. Mustang Sally had been a minor hit for its writer, Mac Rice, but when Pickett got his hands on it, he transformed it. He slowed it down, gave it a greasy, swampy groove, and attacked the lyrics with a potent mix of masculine bravado and raw desire. His ad-libs, "Ride, Sally, ride," became a global catchphrase. The song was pure, distilled Pickett, powerful, a little dangerous, and absolutely irresistible. By the late 1960s, Wilson Pickett was a bona fide superstar. He was a constant presence on the charts, a magnetic performer who could captivate any audience with his dynamic stage show and that astonishing voice. He even proved his versatility with a bold and audacious move in 1968. At the suggestion of Jerry Wexler, he decided to cover a song that seemed like the antithesis of his fiery style, the Beatles' gentle anthemic ballad, "Hey Jude." To make it work, he went back to FAME Studios. And for the session, a young, virtuosic session guitarist was brought in. His name was Duane Allman. Pickett turned "Hey Jude" on its head, transforming the sing-along coda into a screaming, gospel-infused testifying session. And then he let Allman loose. The fiery, revolutionary guitar solo that Duane Allman laid down on that track is now the stuff of legend. It not only helped launch Allman's own legendary career, but it also showed a different side of Pickett, an artist capable of interpreting and reinventing music from any genre. The track became a massive international hit, even earning the admiration of John Lennon and Paul McCartney themselves. For a moment, it seemed like Wilson Pickett could do no wrong. He was the king of soul, a force of nature who had bent the music world to his will. But the same forces that defined his Wicked Pickett persona on stage, the aggression, the raw emotion, the refusal to back down, were proving to be destructive forces in his personal life. The music industry of the 60s and 70s was a world of excess. For a man with Pickett's temperament, already wrestling with demons from his childhood, the constant touring, the easy access to alcohol, and the pressures of maintaining his stardom created a perfect storm. The fire that had lit up the charts began to burn out of control. As the 1970s progressed, the musical landscape began to change. The raw soul of the 60s gave way to the slicker productions of Philly soul, the complex funk of James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic, and the glittering rise of disco. Pickett continued to record, and he had some success, but the string of top 10 hits began to dry up. He left Atlantic Records in 1972, and his career entered a slow, grinding decline. The crowds got smaller, the venues less prestigious, and as the professional frustrations mounted, his personal behavior grew more erratic and more violent. Alcohol became his constant companion, fueling a temper that had always been simmering just beneath the surface. His relationships became fraught with conflict. The man who sang with such passion about love became, according to many accounts, a difficult and sometimes dangerous partner. The stories began to trickle out, no longer confined to hushed rumors within the music industry, but spilling into public view through police reports and court dates. The incidents paint a grim portrait of a man in freefall. In 1987, the Wicked Pickett persona took on a terrifyingly literal meaning. He was arrested in Englewood, New Jersey, after being accused of driving his car onto the lawn of the town's mayor, Donald Aronson, shouting death threats. The dispute was reportedly over the placement of a sign, A few weeks later, he was arrested again, this time for carrying a loaded shotgun in his car. These weren't the actions of a superstar. They were the desperate, angry outbursts of a man losing his grip. He received probation for those incidents, but the pattern continued. The most significant and tragic event occurred in 1993. On April 1st, while driving under the influence, Pickett struck an 86-year-old man named Bill Hodgson. The elderly man was seriously injured, and Pickett was found to have a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit. He was convicted of assault and sentenced to a year in jail and 5 years of probation. The godfather of soul was now a convicted felon. The prison sentence was the nadir of his public life. The media, which had once celebrated his every hit, now covered him as a fallen idol, a classic case of squandered talent. It's a narrative we see all too often, and it's a dangerously simple one. It's easy to judge, to shake our heads and see only a man who threw it all away. But the story is more complicated than that. Was Wilson Pickett simply a victim of his own demons? Unquestionably. His violent upbringing and his lifelong struggle with anger played a huge role. Alcoholism is a disease, one that warped his judgment and amplified his worst impulses. But there's another dimension to this story, a debate that touches on the very nature of the music industry he helped build. Think about the world that created him and then, in many ways, left him behind. He was a black artist from the South who generated millions of dollars for record companies. Like many of his peers, he was part of a system that often prioritized profit over the well-being of its artists. When the hits were coming, the difficult behavior was tolerated, even romanticized as part of his wicked brand. But when the hits stopped, the support structure vanished. He was left to navigate the complexities of fading fame and financial insecurity largely on his own. One of the most poignant, rarely heard facts about Pickett's later years comes from those who knew him then. Despite his public troubles, he was known to be incredibly generous to old friends who had fallen on hard times. He retained a deep love for his roots, for fishing, and for the simple pleasures of life that fame had complicated. A close friend once shared a heartbreaking quote from Pickett during this period. Looking back at his career, Pickett allegedly said, "They loved the scream, but they didn't love the man who was screaming." That single sentence cuts to the heart of his tragedy. The world consumed his pain, his passion, his raw emotion, and turned it into a commodity, a soundtrack for a good time. But when the music faded, the complex, wounded man who produced that sound was left to deal with the echoes. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1991, a moment of immense professional validation that occurred right in the middle of his deepest personal turmoil. The irony is staggering. His legacy was being cemented in stone at the very moment his life was crumbling. In his final years, Wilson Pickett was a largely solitary figure. He continued to perform sporadically, his voice weathered but still capable of flashes of its former glory. But he was no longer a fixture in the public consciousness. He had become a ghost of soul music past, a name that evoked a bygone era. The media had, for the most part, moved on. On January 19, 2006, Wilson Pickett died of a heart attack in a hospital in Reston, Virginia. He was 64 years old. In the end, it was a quiet passing for a man who had lived his life at full volume. His funeral was a testament to the music he made, with performances by his old colleagues from the Falcons and a eulogy delivered by Little Richard. But it was also a somber reflection on a life that promised so much and ended in such isolation. So what is the ultimate legacy of Wilson Pickett? How do we remember a man whose life was such a profound mix of brilliance and darkness? First and foremost, there is the music. It is immortal. You cannot tell the story of soul music without him. His voice is a pillar of the genre. When you hear In the Midnight Hour, you are hearing the very DNA of Memphis soul. When you hear Mustang Sally, you are hearing the sound of unfiltered swagger and joy. His recordings are masterclasses in vocal power and emotional delivery. He influenced countless singers, from rock icons like Robert Plant and Bruce Springsteen to generations of soul and R&B artists who followed. His contribution is undeniable, monumental, and eternal, but his life story holds a different, more somber significance. It is a powerful human-scale tragedy that forces us to look beyond the glamour of the stage. It reminds us that our heroes are fallible, that the same fire that forges genius can also be a source of immense personal pain. His story is a stark illustration of the toll that unresolved trauma, addiction, and the pressures of fame can take on a human being. It also serves as a critical commentary on the music industry itself, a system that has time and again profited from the raw talent of artists, particularly black artists, without providing the care or support needed to navigate the treacherous waters of celebrity. He was the wicked Pickett when it sold records, and a forgotten man when it didn't. His story compels us to ask difficult questions about our own relationship with the artists we admire. Do we celebrate their art while ignoring their humanity? Do we consume their pain as entertainment only to turn away when it becomes too real, too messy, too inconvenient? To truly honor his memory is to embrace all of it, to dance to Land of 1,000 Dances with abandon, and also to sit with the uncomfortable truths of his life, to celebrate the God-given talent that soared from the churches of Alabama to the top of the world charts, and to mourn the wounded man who was never quite able to outrun the shadows of his past. He gave his soul to his music, and perhaps in the end, he had very little left for himself. The spotlight fades, the crowds go home, but that voice waits forever in the midnight hour. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. I appreciate you watching.